In the year 428 BC, while the Great Peloponnesian War raged on, a child was born in one of Athens' most distinguished families. This was not the Athens of legend, the gleaming city of Pericles basking in its golden age. That time was already a fading memory. Pericles himself had died just a year earlier, a victim of the great plague that had swept through the city's overcrowded walls, leaving fear and despair in its wake. The war against Sparta had been grinding on for 3 years, a brutal, relentless conflict that was slowly draining the city of its wealth, its confidence, and its men. The child was born into a world of anxiety, a city whose democratic ideals were being tested by the grim realities of war. His name was Aristocles. The name Plato would come much later. His family belonged to the highest echelon of Athenian society. His father, Ariston, traced his lineage back to Codrus, the last legendary king of Athens, a man said to have sacrificed himself to save the city from invaders. His mother, Pythagorean, boasted an even more impressive ancestry. Her family line led directly to Solon, the great lawgiver and poet who had laid the foundations of Athenian democracy 2 centuries earlier. To be born into this family was to be born with the expectation of greatness. Politics, leadership, and service to the state were not just career choices. They were an inheritance, a duty woven into the fabric of his identity. The household Aristocles grew up in was one of intellectual and political influence. His mother's uncle was Critias, a brilliant but controversial figure, a poet, an orator, and a man whose political ambitions would later cast a dark shadow over Athens. Her brother, Charmides, was also a prominent citizen, known for his striking good looks and his presence in the city's elite circles. These men were part of the fabric of power in Athens. They debated strategy in the war, discussed the philosophy of the sophists, and moved with an assurance that came from generations of privilege. From his earliest days, Aristocles would have been surrounded by conversations about justice, power, and the fate of Athens. He learned that words were tools, that arguments could be weapons, and that the destiny of a city rested on the character of its leaders. His father, Ariston, died when he was still a boy. His mother, Pythagorean, soon remarried. Her new husband was her own uncle, Pyralamps, a man who had served as an ambassador to the great king of Persia and was a close friend and supporter of the late statesman Pericles. This marriage further solidified the family's position within the city's ruling class. Through his stepfather's connections, the young Aristocles was exposed to the inner workings of Athenian politics at the highest level. He would have met generals returning from the front, diplomats speaking of foreign lands, and politicians arguing in the agora. He was a silent observer in a world of powerful men, watching, listening, and forming his own understanding of the city that he was expected one day to help lead. He saw the glory of its traditions, but he also saw the cracks beginning to appear under the strain of a seemingly endless war. This was the world that shaped him, a world of noble ancestry and immense expectation, set against a backdrop of war, disease, and profound political uncertainty. For a boy of his standing, education was not merely about acquiring knowledge. It was about shaping the entire person. The goal of Athenian education for the elite was to produce a man who was kalos kagathos, an ideal of being both beautiful and good, or noble and virtuous. It was a holistic vision that sought to create perfect harmony between the mind, the body, and the soul, preparing him for a life of leadership. This education rested on 2 great pillars: musique for the soul and gymnastique for the body. Musique was far more than just music. It was a broad immersion in the arts of the 9 muses. The core of this education was poetry, and the ultimate textbook was Homer. From a young age, Aristocles would have memorized long passages from the Iliad and the Odyssey. These were not just adventure stories. They were the moral and cultural bedrock of Greek society. Through Homer, a young man learned about arete, the concept of excellence and virtue. He learned about the unpredictable will of the gods, the glory of battle, the importance of honor, and the tragic consequences of human arrogance, or hubris. In a city embroiled in a seemingly endless war with Sparta, these lessons felt deeply immediate and relevant. The heroes and fallen warriors of the Trojan War seemed to live again in the daily news from the battlefronts. He also studied the lyric poets, learning to recite their verses and to play the lyre, an instrument believed to bring order and harmony to the soul. For the Athenians, the rhythms and modes of music were not mere entertainment. They were powerful forces. They believed certain melodies could instill courage and discipline in a man, while others could lead to weakness and chaos. Through music, the soul of a young man was tuned like an instrument, preparing him to live a balanced and virtuous life in service to the city. The second pillar, gymnastic, was the education of the body. In the shaded grounds of the city's gymnasia, he would have trained under the watchful eye of a master, a paedotribes. This was not about building muscle for its own sake, but about instilling discipline, endurance, and grace. The long war meant that this physical readiness was not an abstract ideal. It was a civic duty. Every able-bodied citizen was a potential soldier, and the gymnasium was the primary training ground. He would have learned the arts of wrestling, running, and throwing the javelin and discus. The gymnasium was more than a training ground. It was a social and intellectual hub for the city's elite. Here, older men would gather to exercise, conduct business, and engage in long philosophical conversations while the younger men trained. For Aristocles, it was an environment where physical exertion was inseparable from intellectual debate. It was in this physically demanding world that he reportedly excelled. Ancient sources tell us he was a gifted athlete, particularly as a wrestler. There is a story, perhaps a legend, that he competed in the prestigious Isthmian Games, one of the great Panhellenic festivals. It was apparently his wrestling coach, Ariston of Argos, who gave him the nickname that would eclipse his birth name forever, Platon. In Greek, this means broad. The reason for the name is lost to history, but several theories persist. The most common is that it referred to his physical stature, his broad shoulders, a result of his rigorous training. Others suggest it referred to his wide forehead, a sign of a great intellect, or perhaps, prophetically, to the breadth and fluency of his literary style. Whatever its origin, the name stuck. The boy Aristocles began to fade, and the young man Platon took his place. Beyond this traditional education, the very air of Athens was alive with a new, radical intellectual movement led by the sophists. These men were traveling teachers, intellectual superstars who charged high fees to teach the sons of the wealthy the skills needed for success in a democracy. Their primary subject was rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking. In a city where any citizen could rise to power through his ability to sway the assembly or win a lawsuit, rhetoric was the ultimate tool. Figures like Pythagoras, who famously claimed that man is the measure of all things, challenged traditional notions of truth, arguing that there were no absolute moral standards. For the sophists, what mattered was not finding the absolute truth, but winning the argument. Plato, as a young man destined for politics, would certainly have studied their techniques. His talents were not confined to athletics or debate. He was also a promising poet, which was the natural path for an educated young man of his time. He is said to have written epic poems, lyrical verses, and even dramatic tragedies. His ambition was likely to have them performed in the theater of Dionysius during the great city festivals. Winning the prize for tragedy was one of the highest artistic and civic honors an Athenian could achieve. He had the lineage, the education, and the talent to pursue a life of public distinction. Everything in his upbringing was designed to place him at the heart of Athenian public life, to make him a leader. But he was living in a city that was growing increasingly desperate, and he was about to meet a man who would challenge everything he had ever been taught about success, ambition, and the very nature of knowledge itself. The Athens of Platon's youth was a city brimming with intellectual confidence. The Agora, the city's sprawling central marketplace, was not just a place for commerce. It was a theater of ideas. Ambitious young men, eager to make their mark in politics or the law courts, would gather around the city's most celebrated teachers, the sophists. These men were masters of rhetoric, polished speakers who promised to teach the art of success for a handsome fee. They treated knowledge as a commodity, a set of tools that could be purchased to win arguments, sway crowds, and acquire power. In their world, truth was often secondary to persuasion. The man who could make the weaker argument appear the stronger was the man who would succeed. It was into this bustling marketplace of transactional wisdom that a strange and disruptive figure appeared. He was a man who looked nothing like a sage and who offered nothing that the others were selling. His name was Socrates. He was then in his 60s, a veteran of several military campaigns, a stonemason by trade, and a man of unforgettable ugliness. He had a stout, stocky build, a snub nose, and bulging eyes that seemed to gaze outwards in all directions at once. He rarely wore shoes and was often seen in the same simple, worn-out cloak, regardless of the season. He possessed none of the refined graces of the sophists and carried himself not with an air of authority, but with a kind of profound and often perplexing humility. And most shockingly of all, in a city where knowledge was for sale, he charged no fees. He insisted, to the confusion of everyone, that he had nothing to teach. Socrates' life had been transformed by a strange pronouncement. A friend of his had once traveled to the great oracle of Apollo at Delphi and had asked the priestess if any man was wiser than Socrates. The oracle's answer was no. No man was wiser. When Socrates heard this, he was utterly bewildered. He believed he knew nothing. So he embarked upon what he called a divine mission, to understand the oracle's meaning. He began to seek out the most respected men in Athens, the politicians renowned for their statecraft, the poets celebrated for their inspiration, and the craftsmen admired for their skill. He would approach them in the agora, in the gymnasia, in the workshops, and he would begin to ask them simple questions. To a great general, he might ask, "You are a master of warfare, and everyone says you are courageous. Can you please tell me what is courage?" The general, confident in his expertise, would offer a definition. Perhaps he would say, "Courage is standing your ground in battle and not running away." Socrates, professing his own ignorance, would then gently probe the definition. "But," he might say, "what about soldiers who strategically retreat to lure an enemy into a trap? Is that not also a form of courage?" The general would agree. And so the conversation would continue. With each question, Socrates would reveal a flaw, a contradiction, an exception that the initial definition did not cover. The general's certainty would begin to crumble. A classic example was his encounter with a young religious expert named Euthyphro, who was on his way to prosecute his own father for murder, absolutely certain he understood the nature of piety. Socrates simply asked him to define piety. After a long, circular, and frustrating conversation, Euthyphro left in confusion, his certainty shattered, unable to provide a coherent definition. After a series of such questions with any expert, the man who began the conversation absolutely sure of his knowledge would be left in a state of complete confusion, a state the Greeks called aporia. He would be forced to admit that he did not truly know the nature of the very virtue he was famous for. This was Socrates' method. He did not lecture or preach. He simply questioned. To the ambitious youth of Athens, men like Plato, this was electrifying. Here was a man who was not selling easy answers or formulas for success. He was offering a shared, honest, and often uncomfortable search for truth. He was authentic in a world of performance. To the powerful men he publicly exposed, however, he was a menace. They saw him as a dangerous eccentric who undermined tradition and corrupted the youth by teaching them to question their elders. He was an infuriating gadfly, as he later called himself, sent by the gods to sting the lazy horse of the Athenian state into thinking. Plato was around 20 years old when he became a regular follower of Socrates. He was a young man at the peak of his physical and intellectual powers, handsome, wealthy, and with a brilliant future ahead of him as a statesman or a celebrated poet. On the surface, he had nothing in common with the elderly, impoverished stonemason who roamed the streets of Athens. Yet, for Plato and a circle of other well-born young men, Socrates was a figure of irresistible fascination. This circle was eclectic and included the brilliant but erratic Alcibiades and even Plato's own relative, Critias. They would follow Socrates for hours, listening as he dismantled the arguments of the city's most important figures with his relentless questioning. For Plato, this was more than just an intellectual spectacle. It was a profound personal awakening. What Socrates offered was a radical new understanding of what it meant to be wise. Knowledge, he demonstrated, was not a list of facts to be handed down from a teacher to a student. It could not be bought from a sophist. True knowledge was a state of the soul, and the path to it began with a deeply uncomfortable admission that one knows nothing. This first step of the Socratic method, the systematic cross-examination that led to the state of confusion known as aporia, was a form of intellectual purification. It was designed to strip away the arrogance of unexamined beliefs, to clear the ground of prejudice and second-hand opinions that people mistook for genuine wisdom. Socrates believed that before a man could learn anything true, he first had to realize the full extent of his own ignorance. But this was only the first stage. The second, more constructive stage was what Socrates called maieuteik, or the art of midwifery. He often compared his work to that of his mother, Phaenarete, who had been a midwife. He explained that just as she did not create the baby she delivered, he did not create the ideas in his listeners' minds. He claimed that the truth is not something that can be put into a person from the outside. Rather, it is already lying dormant within their soul, waiting to be born. His role, he said, was to act as an intellectual midwife. Through his carefully aimed questions, he would help the other person to go through the labor of thinking for themselves, to examine their own beliefs, and ultimately to give birth to their own understanding. This was a revolutionary concept. It meant that every person, regardless of their station, carried within them the potential for true insight. The philosopher's job was not to provide answers, but to help others find their own. Adding to his mystique was his claim of a daimonion, a divine sign or inner voice that had guided him since childhood. He described it not as a voice that told him what to do, but as one that only ever warned him against doing something he was about to do. It was this divine sign, he claimed, that prevented him from entering politics, a field he believed was too corrupt for an honest man to survive in. This daimonion set him apart, reinforcing his own belief that his mission in Athens was not a personal choice, but a duty imposed upon him by the gods. He was a man guided by an inner moral compass that was absolute and non-negotiable, a stark contrast to the relativistic teachings of the sophists. For Plato, this encounter was life-altering. The world of political ambition and artistic fame, a world for which his entire education had prepared him, suddenly seemed shallow and unimportant. A famous story, passed down through the ages, tells that after becoming a disciple of Socrates, Plato gathered all the poems and tragedies he had written, works he had hoped would bring him fame, and burned them in a great bonfire. This act was not one of youthful melodrama. It was a definitive renunciation of his former life. It was a declaration that he was abandoning the path of public acclaim for a much harder, less certain journey. He had realized that art, however beautiful, was only an imitation of the world of appearances. Socrates was engaged in something far more important, the search for true reality, for the unchanging knowledge that lay beneath the surface of everyday life. In that moment, Plato the poet died. The path of the statesman was abandoned. A new path, one of philosophical inquiry, opened up before him. He devoted the next 8 years of his life to following this strange, ugly, and utterly brilliant man, listening, learning, and absorbing the method that would become the foundation of his own life's work. The 8 years that Plato spent as a follower of Socrates were a period of intense intellectual discovery, but they unfolded against a backdrop of political catastrophe. In 404 BC, after nearly 3 decades of brutal warfare, the city of Athens finally surrendered to Sparta. The long walls that connected the city to its port, the symbol of its naval empire and its pride, were torn down to the sound of celebratory music played by Spartan pipers. The Athenian democracy, which had grown increasingly unstable and paranoid in the final years of the war, was dismantled. Sparta installed a new government, an oligarchy of 30 Athenian citizens who were sympathetic to Spartan interests. This regime would go down in history as the 30 Tyrants. For Plato, this was a moment of profound and painful conflict. 2 of the leading members of the 30 were his own relatives. His mother's uncle, Critias, became the group's ruthless leader, and her brother, Charmides, was another prominent member. Initially, Plato, who had long been disillusioned with the chaos of democracy, felt a flicker of hope. He was invited to join the new government. It seemed, for a moment, that his class, the educated aristocracy, would finally restore order and justice to the city. He believed they would lead Athens from a life of injustice to a path of righteousness. He was wrong. The rule of the 30 quickly descended into a bloody reign of terror. They executed their political opponents without trial, confiscated the property of wealthy citizens and resident foreigners, and unleashed a wave of violence that horrified the city. They attempted to involve Socrates in their crimes, ordering him and 4 other men to arrest an innocent citizen, Leon of Salamis, so that he could be executed. Socrates, in an act of quiet but profound civil disobedience, simply refused the order and went home, an act that would have certainly cost him his life if the regime had not fallen shortly thereafter. Plato watched in disgust as the men he was related to, men of his own class, proved to be far more corrupt and tyrannical than the democracy they had replaced. His hope for a just political order led by aristocrats was utterly shattered. After just 8 months, the 30 tyrants were overthrown, and democracy was restored in Athens. But the new government was fragile, fearful, and hungry for scapegoats. There was a widespread desire to find someone to blame for the city's long decline, for its military defeat, and for the moral corruption that seemed to have taken root. And in this atmosphere of suspicion and resentment, the city turned its attention to the most prominent and unsettling intellectual figure it had, Socrates. In 399 BC, 3 men, Anytus, a powerful politician, Miletus, a young religious fanatic, and Lyco, an obscure orator, brought formal charges against the 70-year-old philosopher. The charges were twofold. First, that Socrates was guilty of impiety, of not believing in the gods of the state, and of introducing new divinities. This was a vague but serious accusation, tapping into a deep-seated fear that the city had lost the favor of the gods. The charge likely stemmed from Socrates' claims about his daimonion, his personal divine sign, which his accusers twisted into evidence of him promoting a private cult. The second charge was even more dangerous, that he was guilty of corrupting the youth. This accusation was aimed directly at his association with some of Athens' most notorious figures. His former followers included Critias, the leader of the 30 tyrants, and Alcibiades, the brilliant but treacherous general whose actions had done so much to harm Athens during the war. The prosecution argued that Socrates' teachings had filled these men with an arrogant disdain for democracy and traditional values, making him indirectly responsible for the city's misfortunes. The trial was held before a jury of 501 Athenian citizens, a massive panel chosen by lot. Plato was present, watching the proceedings with a growing sense of dread. Socrates was not tried in a formal courtroom, but in the open air of the agora, surrounded by a crowd of his fellow citizens. He could have hired a speechwriter, as was common practice, to craft a persuasive and emotional defense. His friends had urged him to do so. Instead, He chose to speak for himself, in his usual plain and direct manner. He did not plead for his life or appeal to the jury's pity. He did not bring his weeping wife and children before them to beg for mercy. Instead, he subjected the entire trial to the same relentless logical examination he had applied to every other aspect of life. He cross-examined his chief accuser, Meletus, tying him in logical knots and making him look foolish before the entire jury. He explained that his life's work had not been a personal whim, but a divine mission given to him by the oracle at Delphi. He described himself not as a corrupting influence, but as a gadfly sent by the gods to awaken the city from its intellectual laziness. He argued that he was a gift to Athens, and that by seeking to execute him, they were harming themselves far more than they were harming him. It was a performance of incredible intellectual courage, but it was a disaster as a legal strategy. He was not trying to win an acquittal. He was trying to speak the truth, regardless of the consequences. The jury, made up of ordinary men who were likely confused and offended by his arrogant and uncompromising tone, voted to convict him. The margin was narrow, but the verdict was guilty. The conviction was not the end of the trial. Athenian legal procedure had a second stage: the sentencing. Both the prosecution and the defense were invited to propose a penalty, and the jury would then choose between the two options. The prosecution, as expected, proposed death. This was their chance to rid the city of a man they considered a public nuisance. Now it was Socrates' turn. This was the moment where a conventional defendant would have proposed a serious but lesser penalty, such as exile. Proposing exile would have almost certainly saved his life. The jury had convicted him by a narrow margin and would have eagerly accepted any reasonable alternative to execution. His friends, including Plato, were waiting, ready to pay any fine he suggested, no matter how large. But Socrates would not play their game. When asked what penalty he deserved, he responded with breathtaking audacity. He told the jury that, for his decades of service awakening the city's conscience, he did not deserve a punishment at all. Instead, he deserved a reward. He proposed that he should be given free meals for life at the Prytaneum, the sacred public hall where the city honored its Olympic champions and greatest benefactors. To the jury, this was the ultimate insult. It was an act of supreme arrogance, a final confirmation that he truly believed he was superior to them and to the laws of the city. He was mocking the very process that held his life in its hands. After this, he grudgingly suggested a small fine, which his friends, including Plato, immediately offered to increase to a much larger sum, but the damage was done. The jury was enraged. In the second vote, a much larger majority voted for the death penalty. Socrates was condemned to die by drinking a cup of hemlock, a poison that induced a slow and painless paralysis. Normally, the execution would have been carried out within a day or two. But, by a strange twist of fate, the day after his trial marked the beginning of a sacred annual embassy to the island of Delos. During this period, which could last for a month, no state executions were permitted in Athens. This meant that Socrates had to wait in prison until the sacred ship returned. This month-long delay transformed his death from a swift execution into a prolonged philosophical event. The prison became his final classroom. Every day, his friends and followers, a devastated group that included Plato, were allowed to visit him. They found him not in despair, but in a state of calm and even cheerful resignation. He was unbound, free to walk about his cell, and he spent his last days engaged in the activity that had defined his life: philosophical conversation. They talked about the nature of justice, the immortality of the soul, and the meaning of a good life. These final conversations, which Plato would later immortalize in his dialogues, especially the Phaedo, show a man facing his own death with absolute serenity, convinced that no real harm could come to a good man, either in this life or the next. He argued that the soul was immortal, and that death was not an end, but merely a liberation of the soul from the prison of the body. He consoled his grieving friends, urging them not to mourn for him. He had multiple opportunities to escape. His wealthy friend Crito had bribed the jailers and arranged a clear path for him to flee into exile in another city. Crito pleaded with him to take it, arguing that by staying, he was betraying his children and allowing his enemies to win. Socrates refused. He argued that he had lived his entire life under the protection of the laws of Athens. He had chosen to remain an Athenian citizen, and in doing so he had entered into a social contract, an implicit agreement to obey the city's laws, even when they produced an unjust result. To flee now would be to break that contract. It would be an act of injustice that would invalidate his entire life's teaching. He would rather die as a victim of injustice than live by committing an injustice himself. For Plato, this entire ordeal was a defining trauma. He had witnessed the city he was born to serve, the democracy his ancestor Solon had helped create, legally murder the wisest and most just man he had ever known. He saw firsthand that the opinions of the ignorant majority could be marshaled to destroy virtue. The trial proved to him that a state ruled by the unqualified, by men who could be swayed by rhetoric and prejudice, was not just flawed, it was fundamentally diseased. The execution of Socrates was not just a personal loss, it was the collapse of his world. It destroyed any remaining ambition he had for a political career in Athens. How could he participate in a system that had killed his teacher? The event instilled in him a profound and lifelong distrust of democracy and a burning conviction that until philosophers became rulers, or rulers became philosophers, there would be no end to the troubles of the state. It was a lesson written in blood, the foundational event that would fuel his entire philosophical quest, to design a state where a man like Socrates would not be condemned, but honored as a king. The death of Socrates was not the end of the story. It was a violent beginning. In the immediate aftermath of the execution, a chill settled over Socrates' inner circle. Athens was no longer a place of intellectual freedom. It was a city that had just murdered its greatest philosopher. There was a palpable fear among his closest followers, including Plato, that the same democratic faction that had condemned their master might soon turn on them. They were known associates of a convicted traitor and corrupter of the youth. To stay in Athens was to remain in the shadow of the hemlock. For Plato, the city was now tainted. Every street corner where he had once walked with Socrates, every gymnasium where they had engaged in debate, now served as a bitter reminder of his loss and of the city's profound sickness. He felt a combination of grief, rage, and utter disillusionment. The question that had consumed Socrates, how to live a virtuous life, now led Plato to a darker, more urgent question. How is a virtuous life even possible in a corrupt state? His own relatives, the aristocrats of the 30, had proven to be bloodthirsty tyrants. And the restored democracy, the rule of the common man, had shown itself to be an ignorant and envious mob, one that mistakes wisdom for a crime. Both systems had failed spectacularly. Plato knew he could no longer pursue the life that had been planned for him. To enter Athenian politics now would be to compromise with the very forces that had killed his teacher. He had to leave. Shortly after the execution, Plato and a number of other Socratics quietly departed from Athens. Their first stop was the nearby city of Megara. There they were given refuge by Euclid, another devoted student of Socrates and a philosopher in his own right. This period in Megara was likely a time of mourning and intense reflection. In the company of his fellow disciples, Plato could begin to process the catastrophe they had all witnessed. They would have shared their memories of Socrates, piecing together the legacy of a man who had never written down a single word of his own philosophy. It was probably here, in these conversations among grieving friends, that the first seeds of Plato's written dialogues were sown, as an urgent attempt to preserve the memory and the methods of their master before they faded. But Plato soon realized that simply preserving Socrates' memory was not enough. The Socratic method, the art of questioning and revealing ignorance, was a powerful tool for demolition. It could tear down false beliefs and expose intellectual arrogance. But could it build anything in their place? Socrates had shown that the politicians and poets did not know what justice was. But he had never offered a definitive answer himself. If a just society were ever to be built, it needed a foundation. It required a positive vision, a blueprint based on true knowledge, not just the removal of ignorance. Plato knew he could not find the materials for such a blueprint in Athens, nor even in Megara. He needed to seek out older and different forms of wisdom. And so, he embarked on a great journey that would last for more than a decade. This was not a leisurely tour. It was a philosophical quest. He decided to travel to the two ancient centers of knowledge that held the most promise: Egypt and the Greek colonies of southern Italy. He first made his way to Egypt, a civilization that fascinated the Greeks. To them, Egypt was a land of immense antiquity and uncanny stability. While Greek city-states rose and fell in a chaotic cycle of war and revolution, Egypt had endured for millennia, governed by divine pharaohs and guided by a priest class that possessed secret ancient knowledge. Plato sought out these priests. He was likely intrigued by their advanced understanding of geometry, which they used to resurvey the land after the annual flooding of the Nile. He was fascinated by their complex theology and their profound belief in the immortality of the soul and the judgment of the dead. It was here, according to ancient tradition, that the priests told him a story, passed down through their records, of a great and powerful island civilization called Atlantis, which had been swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. For Plato, Egypt was a vision of a society built on order, tradition, and a connection to the divine. Everything the Athens he had fled seemed to lack. From Egypt, his journey took him to southern Italy, a region so heavily colonized by Greeks that it was known as Magna Graecia, or Great Greece. This was a vibrant and wealthy area, a crossroads of culture and a hotbed of philosophical innovation. It was here that Plato would have his second great intellectual encounter, one that would prove to be as formative as his time with Socrates. He came to meet the followers of Pythagoras, the semi-mythical philosopher and mathematician from a century earlier. The Pythagoreans were a secretive and highly disciplined community, almost like a religious brotherhood. They lived by a strict set of rules, practiced vegetarianism, and believed in the transmigration of souls. And at the heart of their philosophy was a revolutionary idea: that the universe itself was built upon the language of mathematics. They believed that numbers were not just tools for calculation, but the fundamental principles of all reality. They found numerical ratios in the harmony of music, in the movements of the planets, and in the structure of the cosmos. Here, Plato found the missing piece he had been searching for. Socrates had given him the method for seeking truth in the human soul. The Pythagoreans offered him a vision of a perfect, eternal, and intelligible order that existed in the universe itself, an order that could be grasped not by the senses, but by pure reason. The two great streams of his future philosophy were beginning to converge. In the Greek cities of southern Italy, particularly in Tarentum, Plato came into direct contact with the leaders of the Pythagorean school. One of the most prominent was Archytas, a brilliant mathematician, a successful military general, and the elected leader of his city. Archytas was the living embodiment of an idea that deeply intrigued Plato: the philosopher as a statesman. He saw in Archytas a man whose political authority was derived from his intellectual and moral virtue, a leader who applied the principles of mathematical harmony to the governance of a city. This was a stark contrast to the chaotic democracy of Athens and the brutal tyranny he had witnessed through his relatives. The Pythagoreans introduced Plato to a worldview that was both mystical and rigorously logical. At the heart of their philosophy was the astonishing claim that the universe is governed by, and can be understood through, numbers. They had discovered that the consonant intervals in music, the octave, the fifth, the fourth, could be expressed as simple numerical ratios. This led them to believe that the same mathematical harmony must govern the movements of the celestial bodies, creating a silent music of the spheres. For them, mathematics was the language of the cosmos. This was a revelation for Plato. Socrates had taught him to search for definitions of ethical concepts like justice and goodness. The Pythagoreans suggested that the entire physical world was a reflection of a deeper, non-physical and eternal reality, the reality of numbers and mathematical forms. The world we see is messy, changing, and imperfect, but the world of mathematics is perfect, eternal, and can only be grasped by the pure intellect, not by the senses. They also held complex beliefs about the soul. They taught that the soul was an immortal entity, a divine harmony temporarily trapped in the physical body as if in a tomb. It was condemned to a cycle of reincarnation, moving from one body to another after death. The only way to escape this cycle was through a life of purification, a life of intellectual study, strict discipline, and contemplation of the eternal order of the cosmos. In these Pythagorean ideas, Plato found the framework he had been searching for. He began to synthesize the Socratic focus on ethics with the Pythagorean vision of a perfect, intelligible cosmos. The quest for the definition of justice could now be seen as part of a much larger quest for an understanding of the eternal order that governs all things. His growing reputation as a unique and powerful thinker eventually brought him to the island of Sicily, and to the most powerful and wealthy Greek city in the world, Syracuse. Syracuse was a vibrant metropolis, but it was ruled with an iron fist by a formidable tyrant named Dionysius I. Dionysius was a brilliant and ruthless military leader who had expanded his empire across Sicily and into mainland Italy. His court was a place of immense luxury, but also of constant paranoia and danger. Plato was invited to this court, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps because he was intrigued by the prospect of observing absolute power firsthand. At the court of Dionysius, Plato met a young man who would alter the course of his life. Dion, the tyrant's brother-in-law. Dion was then about 20 years old, intelligent, noble, and unlike the cynical and power-hungry men around him, he was deeply dissatisfied with the tyrannical lifestyle. He was immediately captivated by Plato's presence and his words. While others at court were interested in flattery and political maneuvering, Dion was thirsty for knowledge. He listened intently as Plato spoke of virtue, of justice, and of a life guided by reason rather than appetite. For the first time, Plato found a student who seemed to fully grasp the revolutionary implications of his ideas. A profound friendship and intellectual bond was formed between the two men. Emboldened by Dion's support and his own unwavering convictions, Plato did not behave like a typical courtier. He did not flatter Dionysius or praise his power. Instead, when given an audience, he spoke frankly. He argued that true happiness for a ruler comes not from luxury and absolute power, but from wisdom and justice. He suggested that the most courageous man is not the one who conquers cities, but the one who conquers his own desires, and that a truly just ruler must be a servant of the law, not its master. For a man like Dionysius, who believed his will was the law, this was an intolerable lecture. The tyrant was accustomed to fear and adulation, not philosophical critique. He was deeply offended by this Athenian intellectual who dared to imply that his life was not a happy one. He saw Plato not as a source of wisdom, but as a source of sedition. Dionysius decided he had to get rid of this troublesome philosopher. But simply executing a well-known guest from Athens could cause a diplomatic incident. So he devised a more cunning and cruel plan. As Plato was set to depart, Dionysius arranged for his passage on a ship commanded by a Spartan admiral named Pallas. He secretly instructed Pallas to either kill Plato on the voyage or, failing that, to sell him into slavery. He was confident that a slave would have no voice to report what had been done. The ship made a stop at the island of Aegina, a state that was currently at war with Athens. Under their laws, any Athenian found on the island was to be arrested and sold. Polus handed Platon over to the local authorities, and the philosopher, the man who had conversed with the intellectual elite of the Greek world, found himself standing on a platform in the slave market, his life and liberty for sale to the highest bidder. This was the ultimate humiliation, the ultimate proof of how fragile human fortune could be. But at this moment of absolute despair, an extraordinary coincidence occurred. A man named Anicetus, a philosopher from Cyrene whom Platon had met earlier in his travels, happened to be in the Aeginetan market that day. He recognized the distinguished thinker being treated like livestock. Horrified, Anicetus immediately stepped forward and paid the asking price, 20 minae of silver, and bought Platon's freedom. When Platon's friends in Athens heard the news and rushed to repay the money, Anicetus refused to accept it, stating that the Athenians were not the only people in the world worthy of the honor of helping Platon. That refused money, the ransom from a philosopher's enslavement, was then used to buy a grove of trees and a small gymnasium just outside the walls of Athens. It was a place dedicated to the hero Academus. It would soon be known simply as the Academy. Platon returned to Athens a changed man. He was now 40 years old, no longer a young disciple mourning his master, but a mature thinker who had traveled the known world and survived its dangers. He had seen the heights of ancient wisdom in Egypt and the profound intellectual order of the Pythagoreans in Italy. He had also seen the depths of human cruelty in the court of a tyrant and had felt the cold chains of a slave. These experiences had forged his convictions into a single, powerful mission. He had seen every form of government fail: aristocracy, democracy, tyranny. He concluded that the problem was not the system, but the people who ran it. The world was governed by ignorance, ambition, and greed. The only long-term solution, he believed, was to create an entirely new kind of education, one that could produce a new kind of leader. With the ransom money that his friend Anicetus had refused to take back, his supporters purchased a plot of land just outside the city walls of Athens. It was a beautiful public grove, shaded by olive and plane trees, with a gymnasium and walking paths. The place was sacred to a local hero named Academus, and so it was known as the Academy. Here, in this peaceful sanctuary, deliberately removed from the noise and political chaos of the city center, Platon founded his school. It was a project that would consume the rest of his life. The Academy was unlike anything the Greek world had seen before. It was not a place where a traveling sophist would give a few lectures for a fee. It was not a forum for the random public debates that Socrates had engaged in. The Academy was an institution, a permanent community of scholars and students dedicated to a collaborative and sustained quest for knowledge. It was, in essence, the first European university. It was a fellowship, a place where members lived, ate, and worked together, bound by a shared passion for understanding the world. Platon's goal was not to dictate answers, but to create an environment where students could learn to think for themselves, to follow an argument wherever it might lead. The curriculum he established was revolutionary, based largely on the Pythagorean model of a gradual ascent from the visible to the intelligible world. Platon believed that before the soul could grapple with the highest questions of philosophy, it first had to be trained to think abstractly. The senses, he argued, were deceptive, showing us only a world of shadows and impermanence. The path to true knowledge required turning away from the senses and towards the pure intellect. The primary tool for this training was mathematics. A famous, though possibly legendary, inscription was said to have been carved over the entrance to the Academy: "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." The preparatory studies consisted of what would later be known as the quadrivium. First came arithmetic, the study of pure number, which taught the mind to deal with concepts that had no physical form. Next was plane geometry, the study of two-dimensional shapes, followed by solid geometry, the study of three-dimensional forms. Then came astronomy, which Plato saw not as observing the physical stars, but as understanding the perfect mathematical motions of celestial bodies. Finally, there was harmonics, the study of the numerical ratios that create musical harmony. These subjects were not taught for their practical applications. They were a form of intellectual gymnastics, designed to purify the mind and accustom it to the contemplation of a perfect, eternal, and non-physical reality. Only after 10 years or more of this rigorous mathematical training were students considered ready for the pinnacle of their education. Dialectic. This was the Socratic art of logical inquiry, a method of question and answer designed to ascend from the specific examples of the world to an understanding of the highest principles of reality. It was a form of intellectual combat where every assumption was challenged and every definition was tested, a cooperative struggle to arrive at the truth. The ultimate goal of the entire program was not to create withdrawn scholars, but to shape the leaders of the future. The academy was Plato's long-term answer to the political sickness he saw all around him. He believed that only those who had gone through this arduous training, who had disciplined their minds and had come to understand the true nature of goodness and justice, were fit to rule. The academy was to be a nursery for philosopher kings, the place from which a new generation of enlightened statesmen and lawgivers would emerge to heal the broken cities of the Greek world. It was Plato's greatest practical hope for humanity. Within the peaceful groves of the academy, Plato dedicated himself to answering the great question that the execution of Socrates had forced upon him. If a society is to be built on justice and goodness, what is the nature of that justice and goodness? How can we know it with certainty? He was wrestling with a problem that had vexed Greek philosophers for centuries. On one hand, thinkers like Heraclitus had argued that everything in the world is in a constant state of flux. "You cannot step into the same river twice," he famously said. "Everything we perceive with our senses is constantly changing, growing, and decaying. A leaf is green, then it turns yellow and withers. A person is young, then they become old. If the physical world is fundamentally unstable, how can we have any stable, certain knowledge about it? Knowledge, by its very nature, must be of something that is permanent and unchanging." On the other hand, Socrates had spent his life searching for stable definitions. He believed that even though we see many different acts that we call just, there must be a single universal essence of justice itself that all these acts have in common. He searched for these universal essences, these definitions, but he never claimed to have found them. He only knew that they must exist. Plato took the Socratic quest and combined it with the insights he had gained from the Pythagoreans. In doing so, he made a revolutionary leap that would become the central pillar of his entire philosophy. He proposed that these essences that Socrates was looking for, justice itself, beauty itself, goodness itself, were not just concepts in the mind. He argued that they were real. In fact, he argued that they were more real than anything in our physical world. This is the foundation of his famous theory of forms or theory of ideas. Plato proposed that reality is divided into two distinct realms. First, there is the world we perceive with our five senses. This is the physical world, the world of appearances. It is the world of trees, rocks, animals, and our own bodies. But this world, Plato argued, is like the world of Heraclitus. It is a world of constant change, of birth and death, of becoming and passing away. Because it is unstable, it cannot be the object of true knowledge. At best, we can have only opinions, beliefs, or doxa about it. But beyond this fleeting world of appearances, there exists another realm, a higher, non-physical reality that is eternal, perfect, and unchanging. This is the world of forms or the world of ideas. This intelligible realm, which can only be grasped by the pure intellect, contains the perfect blueprint for everything that exists in the physical world. For every imperfect, changing tree we see in our world, there is a single, perfect, and eternal form of the tree in this higher world. For every wobbly circle we might draw, there is a perfect form of the circle, whose properties are studied by geometers. And most importantly, for all the flawed examples of justice and beauty we encounter in human affairs, there exists a perfect form of justice and a perfect form of beauty. The relationship between these two worlds is that of an original to a copy, or a reality to a shadow. The physical things in our world are real only to the extent that they participate in, or imitate, their corresponding form. A beautiful sculpture is beautiful only because it partakes of the form of beauty. A just law is just only because it partakes of the form of justice. The physical objects are like pale, flickering copies of the brilliant, eternal originals. This was a complete inversion of common sense. For Plato, the abstract, non-physical world of the forms was the true reality. The concrete, physical world we live in and experience every day was a semi-real, shadowy imitation. The chair you are sitting on is less real than the perfect, unchanging form of the chair that exists in the intelligible realm. This radical idea provided Plato with an answer to the problem of knowledge. How can we have certain and unchanging knowledge? Because the objects of our knowledge, the forms, are themselves certain and unchanging. True knowledge is not about the changing world of the senses. It is the intellect's understanding of the eternal world of the forms. This distinction between the visible world of opinion and the intelligible world of knowledge became the bedrock of the entire educational program at the Academy, and the starting point for all of Plato's later explorations into ethics, politics, and the nature of the human soul. The idea that the world we see is merely a shadow of a higher reality is difficult to grasp. Plato understood this, and he knew that he could not simply explain his theory of forms through logical argument alone. To make this abstract concept more concrete, he often used analogies and allegories drawn from everyday life. One of the most helpful ways to understand the relationship between the physical world and the world of forms is through what can be called the craftsman analogy, which he lays out in his dialogue, The Republic. He asks us to imagine 3 levels of creation, using the example of a simple bed. First, at the highest and most real level, there is the form or the idea of the bed. This is the concept of bedness itself. It is the perfect, eternal, and unchanging blueprint that contains all the essential qualities of a bed. A raised surface for sleeping, a certain size and structure, the purpose of providing rest. This form, Plato suggests, is created by a divine craftsman, or God. There is only one of these perfect forms of the bed. Second, there is a physical bed, the one that a human craftsman, a carpenter, builds. The carpenter looks to the form of the bed in his mind's eye as a pattern or model. He then takes physical materials, like wood and nails, and does his best to create a physical object that embodies that idea. But any bed he builds is just one particular instance of the universal form. It is an imperfect copy. The wood might have a flaw, one leg might be slightly shorter than the others, and eventually, this physical bed will wear out, break, and turn to dust. It is less real than the form because it is a temporary, decaying imitation. Third, there is the work of an artist, a painter who sees the carpenter's physical bed and creates a painting of it. This painting is even further removed from the truth. It is a copy of a copy. It only captures the appearance of the bed from one particular angle. You cannot use it for its intended purpose. You cannot sleep on a painting of a bed. For Plato, this third level, the level of art and imitation, was the lowest and least real of all. This is one of the reasons he was often so critical of art. He saw it as being 3 steps removed from the truth, a mere shadow of a shadow. This 3-tiered analogy was a powerful tool for explaining his vision of reality. The form is the true original. The physical object is a copy. The artistic image is a copy of a copy. The same logic applies to everything in our world. And, most importantly, it applies to abstract concepts. Think of justice. There are countless individual acts and laws in our world that we might call just. These are like the physical beds built by the carpenter. They are all imperfect, temporary, and particular instances. The true philosopher, however, is not interested in merely looking at these specific examples. The philosopher's goal is to do what the carpenter does, to look beyond the physical instances and to grasp, with his intellect, the perfect and eternal form of justice itself. A politician who has only seen specific examples of just laws but has no understanding of the form of justice is like a carpenter trying to build a bed with no true concept of what a bed is. He is merely copying other copies, and his work will inevitably be flawed. But this raises a critical question. If these perfect forms exist in a separate, non-physical, intelligible realm, how can we, as physical beings, ever know them? We never see perfect justice or perfect beauty with our eyes. We never encounter a perfect circle in the natural world. Platone's answer to this is one of his most mystical and influential doctrines, the theory of anamnesis, or knowledge as recollection. He argued that our souls are immortal. Before each soul was imprisoned in a physical body, it existed in the intelligible realm and had direct knowledge of the forms. It saw beauty itself and justice itself in their pure, unadulterated state. The trauma of being born into a physical body, however, causes the soul to forget this perfect knowledge. The memories become hazy and buried deep within us. The process of learning, therefore, is not about putting new information into an empty mind. It is a process of remembering what the soul already knew. When we see an imperfect circle drawn in the sand, it triggers the memory of the perfect form of the circle that our soul once knew. When we witness a courageous act, it reminds our soul of the true form of courage. The objects and experiences of the physical world act as prompts, helping us to recollect the perfect knowledge we have forgotten. This is why a Socratic dialogue works. The philosopher, like a midwife, does not give the student the truth. He uses questions to help the student remember the truth that is already within him. To bring his entire philosophy together, the two worlds, the painful journey to knowledge, the nature of reality, and the philosopher's duty, Plato crafted one of the most powerful and enduring allegories in the history of human thought. In the middle of his great dialogue, The Republic, he asks us to imagine a strange and haunting scene. Imagine an underground cave. In this cave, there are human beings who have been living there since childhood. They are prisoners. Their legs and necks are chained in such a way that they cannot move or turn their heads. They are forced to stare at a flat wall directly in front of them for their entire lives. Behind the prisoners, there is a blazing fire. And between the fire and the prisoners, there is a raised walkway with a low wall, like a puppeteer's screen. Along this walkway, other people are constantly moving, carrying all sorts of objects made of stone and wood, statues of men, models of animals, and other things. The fire casts the shadows of these objects onto the wall that the prisoners are facing. The prisoners cannot see the fire, the walkway, or the statues themselves. They can only see the shadows. And they can hear the voices of the people carrying the objects, but because of the echoes in the cave, the sounds seem to be coming from the shadows themselves. This is the only reality the prisoners have ever known. They give names to the passing shadows. They talk about them, study them, and praise the one among them who is quickest to identify a shadow or predict which one will come next. For them, these flickering shapes on the wall are not shadows. They are the true objects of the world. Their entire society, their knowledge, and their values are built around this world of shadows. Now, Plato asks, what would happen if one of these prisoners were to be freed? Imagine his chains are broken, and he is forced to stand up and turn around. The first thing he would experience is pain. The light from the fire would be searing to his eyes, which are accustomed only to darkness. When shown the actual statues whose shadows he had been watching, he would be completely confused. The solid objects would seem less real to him than the familiar, clear-cut shadows on the wall. He would be disoriented and would want to turn back to the only reality he understands. Imagine then that he is not just freed, but is forcibly dragged up a steep and rugged path, out of the cave and into the world above. The journey is agonizing. When he first emerges into the open air, he would be blinded by the overwhelming light of the sun. He wouldn't be able to see anything at all. But gradually, his eyes would begin to adjust. At first, he would only be able to look at shadows on the ground, then reflections of things in the water. After a while, he could look at the real objects themselves, the trees, the flowers, the houses, and the other people. He would finally understand that the statues in the cave were just manufactured copies of these true and living things. And eventually, after his eyes had grown strong enough, he would be able to look directly at the sun. He would understand that the sun is the source of all light, that it governs the seasons and the years, and that it is the ultimate cause of everything he now sees. He has finally arrived at the truth. Having seen the real world, he would feel immense pity for his former companions, still chained in the darkness, mistaking shadows for reality. He would feel it is his duty to go back down into the cave to share his discovery with them. But his return would be fraught with peril. As he re-enters the darkness, his eyes, now accustomed to the light, would be unable to see clearly. He would stumble and seem clumsy. When he tried to tell the other prisoners that their reality is a sham, that the shadows are mere illusions, they would not believe him. They would see his inability to discern the shadows as proof that his journey outside has ruined him. They would laugh at him and call him a fool. And, Plato concludes grimly, if he tried to break their chains and lead them up into the light, they would become so enraged that they would seize him and kill him. This powerful story is an allegory for Plato's entire philosophy. The cave is the physical world of the senses. The prisoners are all of us, ordinary humanity, trapped by our unexamined opinions. The shadows on the wall are the fleeting physical objects and cultural beliefs we mistake for the truth. The freed prisoner is the philosopher. The painful journey out of the cave is the difficult process of philosophical education. The world above is the intelligible world of forms, and the sun is the highest form of all, the form of the good, which is the ultimate source of all reality and knowledge. The philosopher's reluctant return is his duty to govern and enlighten others, and the prisoner's violent reaction is a clear and bitter reference to the fate of Socrates. The story of the cave is not a standalone tale. It lies at the very heart of Plato's most famous and ambitious work, the dialogue known as the Republic. The philosopher's dangerous return to the darkness is the central problem that this entire book sets out to solve. The dialogue begins with a simple question, posed by an aging Socrates. What is justice? What is this virtue that everyone praises, and why is it better to be a just person than an unjust one? One of the characters in the dialogue, Thrasymachus, puts forward a cynical and challenging argument, that justice is nothing more than the interest of the stronger. He claims that the unjust man, the tyrant who takes whatever he wants, is the happiest of all men, while the just man is a fool who is taken advantage of. Socrates and his companions set out to refute this dangerous idea. To do so, Socrates proposes a unique method. He suggests that understanding justice in a single human soul is difficult, like trying to read small letters from a distance. It would be much easier, he says, if they could first read the same letters written in a larger size. So, he proposes that they construct, in theory, a perfectly just city from the ground up. By understanding how justice works on the large scale of a state, they might then be able to see it more clearly on the small scale of the individual soul. This is the crucial frame for the entire dialogue. The Republic is not primarily a political blueprint intended for immediate application. It is an extended analogy, an exploration of human psychology. The city is a mirror for the soul. Before he can describe the just city, Plato must first describe the soul itself. He argues that the human soul is not a single unified thing. It is a complex entity composed of three distinct parts, often in conflict with one another. To explain this, he uses another brilliant analogy in a different dialogue, the Phaedrus, the allegory of the chariot. He asks us to imagine the soul as a chariot being pulled by two winged horses and driven by a charioteer. The charioteer represents reason, logistikon. This is the part of the soul that seeks truth, that calculates, and that should, in a healthy soul, guide the entire chariot. Its home is in the head. One of the horses is noble and well-behaved. It is white, with a proud bearing. This horse represents spirit, or thymoeides. This is the part of the soul that loves honor, courage, and victory. It is the source of our ambition, our righteous anger, and our sense of shame. When properly trained, this spirited part of the soul is the natural ally of reason, enforcing the charioteer's commands. Its home is in the chest. The other horse, however, is a crooked and unruly beast. It is dark, powerful, and driven by base desires. This horse represents appetite, or epithemedikon. It is the seat of our physical urges for food, drink, sex, and the acquisition of wealth. This part of the soul is irrational and chaotic. If left to its own devices, it will try to drag the entire chariot off the path of reason and down towards the immediate gratification of its desires. Its home is in the belly and the loins. Our life, Plato argues, is a constant struggle to control this chariot. For Plato, justice in the individual is not about following a set of external rules. Justice is the state of internal harmony within the soul. A person is just when the three parts of their soul are in the correct arrangement. The rational part, the charioteer, must be in charge, wisely guiding the chariot towards the truth. The spirited part, the noble horse, must act as reason's courageous ally, helping to keep the unruly appetites in check. And the appetitive part, the dark horse, must be disciplined, its desires satisfied in moderation but never allowed to take control. Justice is a kind of psychic health, where each part of the soul performs its proper function and does not try to usurp the role of the others. Injustice, therefore, is a state of disease and internal chaos. It is a civil war within the soul, a state where the appetites or the love of honor overthrow the rule of reason. The person ruled by their appetites, even if they are a wealthy tyrant who can satisfy every whim, is not truly free or happy. They are a slave to the wild beast within them, their soul in a constant state of turmoil. The just person, the one whose inner world is ordered and harmonious, is the only one who is truly happy and free, regardless of their external fortunes. This is Plato's ultimate answer to Thrasymachus. The just life is better than the unjust life because it is the only life that leads to a healthy, well-ordered, and therefore happy soul. Having established this model of the individual, he was now ready to apply it to the city. Having established that justice in the individual is the perfect harmony of a three-part soul, Plato, speaking through the character of Socrates, now applies this model to the city. The structure of the ideal state, he argues, must perfectly mirror the structure of the ideal soul. Therefore, the just city, which he names Kallipolis, the beautiful city, must also have three distinct classes, each corresponding to a part of the soul and each performing its own unique function. The city begins, he says, out of basic necessity. No single person is self-sufficient. One person needs food, another needs shelter, a third needs clothing. So, people gather together in a community where each person can specialize in a particular craft. The farmer grows food for everyone. The builder constructs houses. The weaver makes clothes. This foundational class of the city consists of its farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and moneymakers. This group corresponds to the largest part of the soul, the appetitive part. The defining characteristic of the producers, as Plato calls them, is their desire for material goods, comfort, and wealth. Their primary role is to provide for the city's physical needs and to keep its economy running. The specific virtue of this class is temperance, the self-discipline to manage their desires and accept the rule of the higher classes. For a time, this simple, healthy city can live in peace. But Plato argues that human nature will inevitably lead it to desire more than just the necessities. The city will want luxuries, fine furniture, exotic foods, art, and entertainment. To acquire these things and the land to support a larger population, the city will eventually come into conflict with its neighbors. And when that happens, the city will need an army. This gives rise to the second, and critically important class of citizens. This class corresponds to the spirited part of the soul. Plato calls them the guardians, or, to be more precise, the auxiliaries. These are the city's professional soldiers, its police force, and its civil servants. Their job is to protect the city from external enemies and to maintain internal order. Plato spends a great deal of time describing the unique character required for this class. He says they must be like well-bred guard dogs, ferocious and deadly towards the city's enemies, but gentle and protective towards their fellow citizens, whom they must treat like a flock of sheep. This requires a rare combination of seemingly opposite qualities. They must be spirited and courageous, but also philosophical and gentle. To cultivate this nature, they are subjected to an intensive and lifelong educational program, based on a carefully censored curriculum of music, poetry, and physical gymnastics, designed to shape their souls and make them virtuous and loyal protectors of the state. Their specific virtue is courage. Not just brute fearlessness, but the knowledge of what should truly be feared and what should not. From this elite group of guardians, a third, even smaller and more exclusive class must be selected. Through years of rigorous training and testing, the city's leaders must identify the very best among the guardians. These are the individuals who have proven themselves to be the most intelligent, the most self-disciplined, and, above all else, the ones who have demonstrated an unwavering love for the city. They are the ones who truly believe that what is good for the city is good for them, and what harms the city harms them. These few individuals, the best of the best, are the ones fit to rule. This ruling class corresponds to the rational part of the soul. These are the true guardians, the ones who will become the philosopher kings. Their entire lives have been a preparation for leadership. Their specific virtue is wisdom, the deep understanding of the eternal forms, especially the form of the good, which allows them to see beyond the shadows of politics and to govern with true knowledge. Justice in the city, then, is the same as justice in the soul. It is the state of perfect harmony that results when each of the three classes performs its own function and does not interfere with the functions of the others. The producers produce, the guardians protect, and the philosophers rule. Justice is the organizing principle that holds the entire structure together. To ensure that every citizen accepts this rigid social hierarchy, Plato proposes that the rulers tell the populace a noble lie, or a magnificent myth. The citizens will be told that they are all children of the earth, brothers and sisters from the same soil. But when the gods formed them, they mixed a different metal into each of their souls. Into the souls of those destined to rule, they mixed gold. Into the souls of the guardians, they mixed silver. And into the souls of the producers, they mixed iron and bronze. This myth, Plato argues, will encourage a sense of civic unity while justifying the natural order of the city, convincing everyone to accept their place in the service of the whole. To create a city founded on perfect justice, Plato understood that he had to eliminate the two greatest sources of corruption in political life: the pursuit of private wealth and the loyalty to one's own family. To protect his ideal state from these dangers, he proposed a series of radical and shocking rules for the two upper classes, the guardians and the philosopher kings. For the producer class, life would remain largely as it was. They could own property, have families, and pursue wealth, so long as it was in moderation. But for the rulers and protectors of the city, life would be completely different. Their existence was to be one of absolute dedication to the state, and this required the complete sacrifice of their private lives. First, Plato proposed the abolition of all private property for the ruling classes. The guardians, from the soldiers to the philosopher kings, were forbidden to own any land, any private homes, or any significant personal possessions. They were not even allowed to touch or be in the same room as gold or silver, which he called a polluting influence. He argued that as soon as rulers possess private wealth, they cease to be guardians and become mere householders and businessmen. They will start to see the citizens not as a flock to be protected, but as a source of personal profit. They will become wolves instead of guard dogs. To prevent this, they would live a communal military-style life. They would sleep in shared barracks and eat their meals together in common messes. All their needs, food, clothing, equipment, would be provided by the state, paid for by a modest tax on the far more numerous producer class. Theirs was to be a life of honor, not of comfort. Their only wealth was the well-being of the city they served. Even more radical than the abolition of property was Plato's second proposal: the abolition of the traditional family. For the guardian class, there would be no private husbands, wives, or children. He saw the family unit, with its intense private loyalties, as a direct competitor to the state. A ruler who is worried about enriching his own children or promoting his own relatives will inevitably make decisions that are not in the best interest of the entire community. To destroy this threat, Plato proposed a system where the entire guardian class would become a single, unified family. There would be no permanent, monogamous marriages. Instead, the rulers would organize sacred mating festivals at certain times of the year. The pairings would be determined by a lottery. But Plato reveals that this lottery would be secretly rigged by the rulers. They would manipulate the results to ensure that the best and most courageous men were paired with the best and most intelligent women. The goal was explicitly eugenic, to breed the best possible offspring for the next generation of guardians. As soon as the children were born, they would be taken from their mothers and raised together in state-run nurseries by specially appointed caretakers. No mother would know her biological child, and no child would ever know their biological parents. All the children born in a certain period would be taught to call all the men who mated in that period father, and all the women mother. In this way, every guardian would be forced to treat every child of the next generation as their own. Nepotism and inherited privilege would become impossible. Within this shocking social structure, however, Plato embedded one of his most progressive and forward-thinking ideas: the equality of women. Having dismantled the private household, he saw no reason to maintain traditional gender roles. Plato argued that the differences between men and women in terms of physical strength were irrelevant to the question of leadership. The soul, he insisted, has no gender. Therefore, if a woman is born with the soul of a guardian, a soul mixed with silver, she should receive the exact same education and be given the exact same duties as the men. She would train in the gymnasia, learn the arts of war, and fight alongside male soldiers. And if a woman was found to have the soul of a philosopher king, a soul of pure gold, she would be trained in mathematics and dialectic, and she would be eligible to rule the city. To exclude such talented individuals from public service simply because of their sex was, in Plato's view, a foolish waste that no rational city could afford. This entire radical system, the communism of property, the abolition of the family, the equality of women, was all designed to create and sustain the perfect ruler, the philosopher king. It was Plato's final dramatic answer to the problem of politics. He concludes with his most famous declaration: "Unless philosophers rule as kings, or those who are now called kings and leading men genuinely and adequately philosophize, there will be no end to the evils for cities, nor, I think, for the human race." The beautiful city was not a dream of comfort, but a machine of immense sacrifice, a city designed with one goal in mind: to enthrone wisdom as its absolute ruler. For years, the beautiful city of Callipolis was a purely theoretical construct, a subject of debate and discussion within the calm groves of the academy. Plato, now entering his 60s, was the revered master of his school, a man who had traded the uncertainties of political life for the intellectual certainties of philosophy. It seemed his life's work would be to teach and to write, to create the blueprint for a better world but never to build it. Then, a message arrived from Sicily, a letter that would drag him from the world of ideas and back into the dangerous world of men. It was an invitation to put his entire philosophy to the ultimate test. Nearly 20 years had passed since his first disastrous visit to Syracuse. The formidable tyrant, Dionysius I, was dead. His empire had passed to his son, Dionysius II, a young, undisciplined man who had been raised in the stifling luxury of the court and had little experience of the world. Plato's old and dearest friend, Dion, was still a powerful figure in Syracuse. Dion saw a unique, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The new tyrant was not yet a hardened ruler. His character was still malleable. If Plato himself, the greatest thinker of the age, could come and be his tutor, perhaps the young man could be molded into the world's first true philosopher king. Dion sent an urgent plea to his old master. He argued that this was the moment they had always discussed. The chance to unite political power with philosophical wisdom was no longer a hypothetical scenario. It was a real possibility. The fate of the most powerful state in the Greek world, and a chance to prove that philosophy was not just empty talk, hung in the balance. Plato was deeply hesitant. He vividly remembered the paranoia of a tyrant's court, and the humiliation of being sold as a slave. He was an old man now, and he had no desire to trade the tranquility of the academy for the deadly intrigues of Syracusan politics. As he later wrote in his personal account of these events, the seventh letter, he was afraid of being seen as a man who was all words and no action, but he was also terrified of failure, which would bring shame upon both himself and his philosophy. In the end, his sense of duty won out. He felt he would be a traitor to his own teachings if he refused this one slim chance to bring his ideal city to life. If he, the author of the Republic, was not willing to risk everything for the sake of justice, then his life's work would be meaningless. And so, in the year 367 BC, Plato set sail for Sicily once more. His arrival in Syracuse was a spectacular success. The young tyrant, Dionysius II, was immediately captivated by the famous philosopher. He showered Plato with honors and treated him as his most trusted advisor. For a brief, intoxicating period, it seemed the dream was becoming a reality. The entire atmosphere of the court was transformed. The usual decadent parties and drunken revelries were replaced by intense philosophical discussions. Plato began to teach the young ruler the basics of his curriculum, starting, as he always did, with geometry. The tyrant became obsessed. Soon, the entire court was swept up in this new intellectual fad. According to the historian Plutarch, the floors of the royal palace were covered in sand, as courtiers everywhere were busy drawing triangles and circles, debating the properties of mathematical forms. It was a golden moment. The beautiful city seemed to be rising from the pages of the Republic and taking shape in the real world. But this philosophical revolution created deep resentment among the old guard at court. The veteran politicians and military commanders who had served Dionysius's father saw their influence over the young ruler evaporating. They saw Plato as a foreign charlatan and Dion as a cunning schemer, using abstract philosophy as a smokescreen to seize power for himself. They began a campaign of whispers and slander, feeding the tyrant's natural insecurities. They told him that Plato's teachings were designed to make him a weak, ineffective ruler. They warned him that Dion's real plan was to distract him with triangles and philosophical puzzles while Dion himself took command of the army and the treasury. Dionysius, who lacked the mental discipline for the arduous journey of philosophy and was possessed of a deeply suspicious nature, began to believe them. His initial fascination with Plato was shallow. He had wanted the reputation of being a philosopher without doing the hard work of becoming one. His paranoia grew. He saw his uncle Dion not as a loyal advisor, but as his greatest rival. The conflict finally erupted. Dionysius accused Dion of conspiring with Carthage, the city's great enemy. He had his uncle arrested, and without a trial, placed him on a small boat and exiled him from Syracuse. Plato's protector was gone. The philosopher was now alone, trapped on an island at the mercy of a young, insecure, and increasingly erratic tyrant who had just banished his closest advisor. The dream was rapidly turning into a nightmare. With Dion exiled, Plato's position at the Syracusan court became precarious and strange. He was no longer an honored guest, but he was not quite a prisoner either. Dionysius, despite his paranoia, was desperate not to appear as a brutish tyrant who had rejected the world's greatest philosopher. He needed Plato's presence for his own reputation. And so, Plato was kept in a kind of gilded cage. He was moved into the Acropolis, the tyrant's personal fortress, where he was treated with lavish hospitality but was constantly under watch. He was a captive, surrounded by luxury. Dionysius made a concerted effort to win Plato's friendship and loyalty, to essentially replace Dion in his affections. He would engage Plato in philosophical conversations, attempting to show off his own intellectual prowess. But Plato saw through the charade. The tyrant's interest was superficial. He was a dilettante who wanted the prestige of being called a philosopher without undertaking the soul-altering work that philosophy required. He wanted to memorize a few clever doctrines to impress his courtiers. Plato, in turn, continued to press the tyrant to live a more disciplined life and, crucially, to allow Dion to return from exile. The relationship grew strained. Plato was a constant reminder of the higher moral standard that Dionysius was failing to meet, and the tyrant grew to resent his captive teacher. After some time, a war broke out, which provided a pretext for Plato's departure. Dionysius allowed him to leave Syracuse, but only on the condition that he would return once the war was over. The tyrant made a promise. If Plato came back, Dion would be allowed to return as well. Plato agreed and went back to Athens. But Dionysius had no intention of keeping his word. Once Plato was gone, the tyrant committed a final, unforgivable act of betrayal. He confiscated Dion's vast fortune and, in a calculated act of personal humiliation, forced Dion's wife, Aristocrat, to divorce him and marry one of the tyrant's own political allies. This was a grave insult, designed to sever all of Dion's ties to Syracuse and provoke him beyond measure. News of this outrage spread throughout the Greek world. In Athens, Dion began to plan his revenge, gathering support and hiring a small army of mercenaries. The situation was spiraling towards a violent conflict. Incredibly, it was at this moment that Dionysius, still craving the intellectual legitimacy that only Plato could provide, sent ships to Athens and summoned the philosopher to return for a third time. Plato's friends were aghast. To even consider returning to the court of a man who had betrayed him so completely seemed like madness. And yet Plato went. He later explained this astonishing decision in his 7th letter. He was nearly 70 years old, and he knew the chances of success were almost zero. But Dion was now committed to invading Sicily, and Plato felt a desperate final obligation to try and prevent a bloody civil war. He hoped he could use his influence to mediate a peaceful reconciliation between the two men. It was his last, faint hope of averting a tragedy. The third journey was a catastrophe from the start. Plato arrived to find a tyrant whose paranoia had curdled into outright hostility. Dionysius subjected him to tests of loyalty, became enraged when Plato continued to defend Dion, and finally stripped away all pretense of hospitality. Plato was placed under armed guard, a prisoner confined to the palace gardens. His life was now in imminent danger. He was only saved by the direct intervention of his old friend, Aristocles of Tarentum. The Pythagoreans sent a warship and a diplomatic envoy, issuing a firm demand for the philosopher's release. Dionysius, not wishing to provoke a powerful state like Tarentum, reluctantly allowed Plato to leave. Plato returned to Athens, a frail old man, his experiment in practical politics over for good. The tragedy he had tried to prevent then unfolded. Dion, his patience gone, invaded Sicily with his small army. In a stunning campaign, he captured Syracuse and overthrew Dionysius, and was hailed by the people as a liberator. But the student of philosophy found that ruling was far more difficult than conquering. Dion proved to be a stern and uncompromising leader, unable to navigate the treacherous currents of Syracusan politics. He alienated his supporters and failed to establish a stable government. Just a few years after his triumph, Dion, the man who was to be the first philosopher king, was brutally assassinated, betrayed by one of his own officers. The entire decade-long Sicilian venture had ended in disaster. Imprisonment, betrayal, and the murder of his dearest friend. Plato had learned the hardest lesson of all, that even the best philosophical ideals could be shattered against the brutal reality of human ambition and the corrupting nature of power. Plato returned to Athens for the last time a man in his late 60s, profoundly marked by the years of political struggle and personal tragedy. The dream of finding a philosopher king, of molding a real-world ruler in the image of the ideal, was dead, buried in Sicily with his friend Dion. He now retreated permanently to the life he had created at the academy. He would spend the final decade of his life teaching, reflecting, and writing. The dialogues he produced in this late period have a distinctly different tone from his earlier work. The vibrant, dramatic character of Socrates often fades into the background or disappears completely. The style becomes less conversational and more systematic, as Plato sets down the final form of his life's thought. And it is here, in his last and longest work, that we see the full impact of the lessons he learned in Syracuse. This final great project was the dialogue called The Laws. It is a massive and detailed work, his final attempt to design a good city. But this city is not the beautiful, idealistic Callipolis from the Republic. The dialogue is a conversation between three old men as they walk, discussing the foundation of a new colony. The city they design is explicitly called a second-best city. Plato, through the main speaker of the dialogue, acknowledges that the ideal city, where rulers possess perfect wisdom, is a pattern laid up in heaven. The city of the laws, named Magnesia, is a city for actual human beings, not for gods or the children of gods. Having failed to find a living embodiment of wisdom in a philosopher king, Plato now turns to the next best thing, a government ruled by wise and supreme law. This is the central, crucial shift between the Republic and the laws. In the Republic, the philosopher kings were above the law, because their perfect wisdom allowed them to make perfect judgments in any situation. Their rule was the rule of pure reason. In the laws, the law itself is sovereign. Every official, from the highest to the lowest, is a servant of the law. This is the great lesson Plato learned from the arbitrary and lawless power of Dionysius. A stable society, he now believed, cannot be based on the wisdom of a single person, which is a rare and fragile thing. It must be based on a permanent, well-designed, and universally respected legal code. In this second-best city, Plato brings back two major institutions that he had abolished for the rulers in the Republic: private property and the traditional family. His experience had taught him that these were too deeply ingrained in human nature to be eliminated without creating massive social strain. However, he does not leave them unregulated. He proposes strict limits on the amount of wealth a citizen can accumulate, to prevent the corrosive effects of extreme poverty and extreme riches. Every citizen is allotted a plot of land that can never be sold, ensuring a basic level of economic stability for all families. Marriage is not a private affair. It is a public duty, mandatory for all citizens for the purpose of procreating for the state. Every aspect of family life is to be supervised by public officials to ensure it is orderly and moderate. The government of Magnesia is no longer a pure aristocracy of the intellect. It is a carefully designed mixed constitution, an idea that would have an immense influence on later political thinkers. Plato blends elements of democracy, such as a popular assembly and officials chosen by lot, with elements of aristocracy, such as powerful elected magistrates who must meet high property and age qualifications. The goal is to create a system of checks and balances, where no single part of the state can become too powerful, ensuring stability and preventing the decay into tyranny or mob rule that he had witnessed in his lifetime. The role of philosophy in this city is also different. It is no longer embodied in a single all-powerful ruler. Instead, it is institutionalized in the city's highest authority, a body called the Nocturnal Council. This is a committee of the 10 oldest and wisest state officials, who meet every day before dawn to study the city's laws, and to contemplate the highest principles of philosophy, astronomy, and theology upon which those laws are based. This council is the philosophical anchor of the state, the permanent body tasked with ensuring that the laws of Magnesia remain in harmony with the divine and rational order of the cosmos. It is a far more cautious and pragmatic vision than that of the philosopher king. It is the political testament of a man who had aimed for the sun, and having been burned, now sought to build the best, most stable, and most durable society possible here on the solid ground of the earth. In the final phase of his life, having laid out his ultimate vision for a city of laws, Plato turned his gaze from the affairs of men to the structure of the universe itself. The Nocturnal Council of his last dialogue was tasked with aligning the city's laws with the divine order of the cosmos. In another of his late works, the Timaeus, he gives his fullest and most spectacular account of what he believed that cosmic order to be. The dialogue is unique among his writings. It is not a Socratic debate, but a long, sweeping monologue, presented by the Pythagorean philosopher Timaeus of Syracuse. He offers his account not as an exact science or a final truth, but as a likely story or a plausible myth, the most rational explanation possible for the creation and nature of the visible world. At the heart of this story is a figure called the demiurge, which in Greek means craftsman. The demiurge is not a creator god in the sense of making something out of nothing. Plato's craftsman is a divine, benevolent, and perfectly rational being who does not create the universe from scratch. Instead, he begins with two pre-existing realities. First, the eternal and perfect world of forms, which serves as his unchanging blueprint, and second, a formless, chaotic, and discordant state of matter, a kind of disorderly motion that Timaeus calls the receptacle. The demiurge, being good, wishes to make the chaotic world as good and as beautiful as possible. So, like a master artisan, he looks to the perfect model of the forms and imposes a rational mathematical order upon the chaos, shaping it into the best possible image of the eternal pattern. The cosmos that emerges from his work is not a dead, lifeless machine. The very first thing the demiurge creates is the world soul. He fashions this soul from a mixture of fundamental principles and weaves it throughout the entire fabric of the universe. The cosmos, therefore, is a single gigantic living creature. It is a blessed God, endowed with reason and intelligence by the providence of its creator. The physical body of this cosmic animal is a perfect sphere, the most complete and unified of all shapes. The world soul drives it in a motion that is also perfect, a uniform circular rotation. For Plato, time itself is born from this motion. The eternal realm of the forms is, by its nature, timeless. But when the demiurge structured the heavens, he created the sun, moon, and planets, whose regular repeating orbits provide a moving image of eternity. This celestial clock is what we call time. The influence of the Pythagoreans on this vision is immense. The demiurge is a divine mathematician, and the language he uses to order the universe is geometry. Plato presents a stunning theory of matter. The four traditional elements, fire, earth, water, and air, are not the fundamental building blocks of reality. They are themselves composed of something more basic. Two types of microscopic, right-angled triangles. These elementary triangles combine in specific numbers to form the five perfect three-dimensional shapes known as the Platonic solids. The tetrahedron, with its sharp points, forms the particle of fire. The stable cube forms the particle of earth. The octahedron forms air, and the icosahedron forms water. The fifth and most complex solid, the dodecahedron, which most closely approximates a sphere, is used by the demiurge to shape the cosmos as a whole. This was a breathtaking idea. The entire physical world at its most fundamental level is a manifestation of pure mathematical structure. Human beings are then created as microcosms, smaller-scale reflections of the great macrocosm. Our immortal and rational souls, Plato says, are fashioned by the demiurge himself, made from the leftover materials of the world's soul. These individual souls are then assigned to stars. The creation of our physical bodies and our mortal souls, the spirited and appetitive parts, is left to lesser younger gods. Our task in life is a philosophical one. We are born into a state of confusion, our rational soul disrupted by the chaotic motions of the physical body. The goal of a good life is to restore order and harmony to our inner world. We can achieve this, Plato argues, by studying the heavens. By observing the perfect, orderly, and unchanging revolutions of the planets, the visible manifestation of the world's soul, we can learn to bring the disordered revolutions in our own heads back into harmony with the divine reason of the cosmos. The study of astronomy is thus a path to inner peace and moral virtue. This grand unified vision of a divinely crafted, mathematically intelligible universe would become one of Plato's most enduring legacies, shaping Western scientific and theological thought for more than 1,500 years. As Plato grew into old age, presiding over his academy and composing his final, great dialogues, the school he had founded 40 years earlier was in its prime. It was a magnet for the brightest young minds from all over the Greek world. And in the year 367 BC, the same year that Plato embarked on his second fateful journey to Sicily, a 17-year-old boy from a remote town in northern Greece arrived in Athens to join the school. His name was Aristotle, and he was destined to become the Academy's most brilliant and ultimately most challenging student. Aristotle's background was starkly different from Plato's. He was not an Athenian aristocrat, born to a life of politics and poetry. He was the son of a man named Nicomachus, who was the personal physician to the king of Macedon, the powerful kingdom rising in the north. This upbringing gave Aristotle a profoundly different intellectual orientation. While Plato's mind had been shaped by the abstract perfection of geometry, Aristotle's had been shaped by his father's world of medicine and biology. He was trained in the practice of close empirical observation of the natural world. He was a man inclined to study the particular, tangible details of life, not to turn away from them in search of a higher reality. For the next 20 years, from the age of 17 until Plato's death at the age of 81, Aristotle remained at the Academy. He was, by all accounts, its star pupil. Plato is said to have called him the mind of the school, a testament to his sheer intellectual firepower. There's a story that Plato once remarked that his students needed two things: a bridle for the eager and brilliant Aristotle, and a spur for the slow and steady Xenocrates. Aristotle was a voracious reader and a tireless investigator, absorbing every aspect of the Academy's curriculum. His own early writings, which have since been lost, were reportedly dialogues written in a beautiful, flowing style that consciously imitated the master's own. For 2 decades, he was a devoted Platonist, a loyal member of the school. But even as he mastered Plato's philosophy, Aristotle's own scientific and empirical instincts began to lead him toward a fundamental disagreement with his teacher. It was a respectful but profound intellectual divergence that would ultimately split the entire tradition of Western thought in two. The core of the issue for Aristotle was what he called the problem of charismos, or separation. Plato had placed his perfect and eternal forms in a separate, intelligible realm, completely apart from the physical world we inhabit. The perfect form of a horse, for example, existed in some heavenly place, while the physical horses we see are mere copies. To Aristotle's practical, biologist's mind, this made no sense. How could the essential nature of a horse, its horseness, exist independently of all actual horses? He argued that the essence or the form of a thing must be within the thing itself. The form of a horse is not a heavenly blueprint. It is the internal structure, the organizing principle, that makes a particular chunk of matter into a living, breathing horse. While Plato's philosophy pointed upwards, towards the heavens and the world of abstract forms, Aristotle's pointed downwards, towards the earth and the concrete individuals we can actually observe. He did not want to turn away from the world of the senses. He wanted to understand it, to classify it, and to explain it in all its rich and fascinating detail. This difference in temperament defined their relationship. It was a relationship of immense mutual respect, but one with a growing intellectual chasm. While Plato lived, this chasm was bridged by their shared life in the academy. Then, in 347 BC, after 40 years at the head of his school, Plato died peacefully in his sleep, according to one tradition, while attending a wedding feast. He had lived to be over 80 years old. He left behind an institution that would continue for centuries, and a body of writing that would set the agenda for all of philosophy to come. But his death also meant that his greatest student, the man he had called the mind of the school, was now free to pursue his own, radically different path. With Plato's death, the leadership of the academy was now open. By all rights, it should have passed to Aristotle, the school's most distinguished and brilliant member for the past 20 years. But it did not. The position of scholarch, or head of the school, was given instead to Plato's own nephew, Speusippus. The reasons for this are debated by historians. It may have been a simple legal matter. As a non-Athenian citizen, a metic or resident alien, Aristotle could not legally own the property of the academy. Or it may have been a philosophical decision. Speusippus was seen as a more faithful follower of the master's doctrine, while Aristotle's dissenting views were already becoming clear. Whatever the reason, the message was unmistakable. Aristotle's time at the academy was over. Disappointed, he left Athens. This departure marked the formal, definitive split between the two greatest philosophical minds of the ancient world. Aristotle was no longer a Platonist. He was now the founder of his own distinct tradition. He traveled for a time throughout the Greek world, and on the island of Lesbos, he conducted pioneering research into marine biology, dissecting fish and observing the habits of sea creatures with a scientist's keen eye. A few years later, he received a fateful invitation. Philip II, the powerful king of Macedon, asked Aristotle to come to his court and serve as the private tutor to his 13-year-old son. That son was the young Prince Alexander, the boy who would one day become Alexander the Great. While Plato had failed to turn a tyrant into a philosopher, his greatest student was now tasked with educating the man who would become the world's greatest conqueror. Many years later, after Alexander had begun his conquest of Asia, Aristotle returned to Athens. Just a short walk from his old school, the academy, he founded a rival institution of his own, the Lyceum. Here, he and his students embarked on one of the most ambitious research projects in the history of human thought. While the Platonists at the academy continued to contemplate the abstract truths of mathematics and the eternal world of the forms, Aristotle and his followers, who became known as the Peripatetics because they walked about as they talked, were engaged in a systematic study of the observable world. They collected hundreds of plant and animal specimens, creating the first great classification of the natural world. They gathered and analyzed the constitutions of 158 different Greek city-states to understand how politics actually worked. Aristotle, in essence, was inventing the disciplines we now know as logic, physics, biology, ethics, and political science. The fundamental disagreement between these two schools, and between these two men, is perfectly captured in a single iconic image: Raphael's great Renaissance fresco, The School of Athens. At the very center of the painting, walking side by side, are the two masters. Plato is the old man, his face modeled on that of Leonardo da Vinci. He points one finger upwards, towards the heavens, the transcendent source of all truth, the perfect and eternal world of forms. Next to him is Aristotle, younger and more vigorous. He holds his hand out flat, palm facing downwards towards the earth. His gesture is a clear rebuttal to his teacher. It signifies his belief that reality is not to be found in some otherworldly realm, but right here, in the tangible, observable, and concrete world that we inhabit. This single image encapsulates the great schism in Western thought that began with these two men. It is the enduring conflict between idealism and realism, between the rationalist who trusts in pure reason and the empiricist who trusts in observation. Is truth a perfect pattern that exists outside of our world, which we can only grasp with our intellect? Or is truth something we must discover by carefully studying the particular imperfect things of this world? This was the great question that the student posed to his master, a question that has echoed through the corridors of philosophy, science, and religion ever since. The path that Aristotle took out of the academy gate was more than just a personal journey. It was the moment that Western philosophy divided into the two great streams that have flowed down to us through the centuries. One stream is Platonic. It is the stream of the idealist, the mystic, the mathematician. It is the belief in a higher, transcendent reality, a world of perfect and eternal truths that lies beyond the veil of the senses. This is the stream that flows through the Christian theology of St. Augustine, who saw the forms as ideas in the mind of God. It nourished the Neoplatonists of the Renaissance, and it ran through the rationalist philosophies of thinkers like Descartes, who sought to build knowledge on the foundation of pure reason. It is the philosophy that points upwards, a constant reminder of the soul's yearning for a perfection not found in this world. The other stream is Aristotelian. It is the stream of the realist, the empiricist, the biologist. It is the belief that knowledge begins with careful observation of the world around us. This is the stream that was preserved and expanded upon by the great Islamic scholars of the Middle Ages. It was integrated into Christian doctrine by Thomas Aquinas, and it provided the intellectual groundwork for the scientific revolution. It is the philosophy that points downwards, a call to investigate, classify, and understand the intricate workings of the natural world. In a very real sense, the entire history of Western thought can be seen as a long and complex conversation between these two great minds, between the master who dreamed of a perfect world beyond, and the student who sought to understand the world we inhabit. So why, after 24 centuries, does Plato remain such a monumental and inescapable figure? What is the source of his enduring power? Part of the answer is that he was the first to ask, in a systematic and profound way, all of the big questions. What is the nature of reality? What is the difference between knowledge and opinion? What is virtue? What is justice? What is the ideal form of human society? What is the relationship between the body and the soul? Nearly every major problem that has occupied Western philosophy since his time was first formulated in his dialogues. He did not always provide the final answers, but he framed the essential questions. Another part of his genius lies in the way he wrote. He did not write dry, systematic treatises. He wrote dramatic dialogues, living conversations filled with character, irony, and suspense. By choosing this form, he does not simply present a finished doctrine for the reader to memorize. Instead, he shows the philosophical process itself, with all its twists, turns, and dead ends. His dialogues do not demand passive acceptance. They demand active participation. They invite us, the readers, to join the conversation, to wrestle with the arguments for ourselves, to experience the thrill of the intellectual hunt. It is this literary and dramatic power that has kept his work alive, not as a museum piece, but as a living source of intellectual challenge and inspiration. But his most profound and enduring legacy is the vision at the heart of his entire philosophy. The simple, powerful, and deeply human idea that there is more to this world than meets the eye. It is the belief that beyond the chaotic and often painful world of our senses, there exists a deeper reality, one that is permanent, meaningful, and good. The allegory of the cave is more than just a philosophical argument. It is a myth that speaks to a fundamental human experience, the feeling that we are living in a world of shadows, and the yearning to break free and find the light. This vision of a two-layered reality, of a transcendent order that gives meaning to our fleeting existence, is an idea of incredible power. It has shaped the core tenets of major religions, inspired countless works of art and literature, and even subtly guided the path of science, which seeks to find the unchanging laws that lie hidden beneath the chaotic surface of phenomena. The 20th century philosopher Alfred North Whitehead famously remarked that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. The statement is not an exaggeration. He set the agenda for an entire civilization. The beautiful city of Callipolis was never built on earth. The philosopher king was never found. The academy he founded was eventually destroyed by a Roman general, and its groves were cut down. But the words he wrote, the questions he asked, and the intellectual world he created proved to be more durable than any city of stone. Plato built an empire of the mind, and it is an empire in which we are all still living.